The hearing room on the 7th floor of the Granite County Courthouse smelled of old varnish and recycled air. Attorney North adjusted the strap of her briefcase and glanced at the defendant seated beside her. Rook, now 37 years old, his hands folded on the table with the stillness of someone who had learned to conserve movement. 20 years in a maximum security facility had etched lines around his eyes that didn't belong to a man convicted at 17. Across the room, Prosecutor Slate shuffled a stack of exhibits, his jaw set. The judge, a woman known in appellate circles as Keystone, entered from chambers and took her seat without ceremony. This was the 4th evidentiary hearing in 18 months, and everyone in the gallery understood the stakes. A single hair recovered from the victim's jacket, preserved in an evidence envelope for 2 decades, had been subjected to mitochondrial DNA sequencing unavailable during the original trial. The results excluded Rook, but exclusion was only the beginning of the story. The paradox had haunted the case from the start. How could a teenager with no criminal violence history, no connection to the victim, and a work schedule that placed him miles away become the centerpiece of a murder conviction? And how could that same conviction, built on scientific testimony and corroborated witness statements, crumble 2 decades later on the strength of genetic material invisible to the microscopes that had sealed his fate? The answer lay not in a single moment of injustice, but in a cascade of systemic failures, each procedurally sound by the standards of its time, each catastrophic in hindsight. Rook had been 17 when the crime occurred, a high school junior who worked weekends stocking shelves at a convenience store in the small city of Riverbend. The victim, a college student known in these proceedings as Ember, had been found in a parking structure near the downtown transit hub on a January morning, her body positioned against a concrete pillar. She had been strangled. The medical examiner, a veteran pathologist aliased as Dr. Crescent, testified at trial that petechial hemorrhages and ligature marks indicated asphyxiation, likely manual, and that the time of death fell between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. the previous night. Ember's jacket bore trace evidence, fibers consistent with automotive interiors, a smudge of motor oil, and 3 strands of hair clutched in her right hand. One of those hairs would become the fulcrum of everything that followed. The investigation moved quickly under pressure from local media and Ember's family. Lead Detective Harbour, a 16-year veteran of the Riverbend Police Department, canvassed the area and identified Rook through a tip from a confidential informant, a fellow inmate at the Juvenile Detention Center where Rook had served 30 days for a prior misdemeanor trespass charge. The informant, aliased as Flint, claimed Rook had bragged about teaching someone a lesson near the transit hub. Harbour brought Rook in for questioning the same week. The interrogation lasted 9 hours, conducted in a windowless room with no video recording. Department policy at the time did not require it for juvenile suspects unless a parent specifically requested documentation. Rook's mother, Iris, had not been notified until hour 6, and by then Rook was alone with Harbour and a second detective aliased as Crane. The transcript of that interrogation, later obtained through post-conviction discovery, revealed a textbook example of what forensic psychologists would come to recognize as coercive interviewing. Harbour opened with assurances. They knew Rook had been in the area, they had physical evidence, they just needed him to explain what happened so the judge would understand it wasn't premeditated. Crane played the skeptic, suggesting that staying silent made Rook look guilty and that cooperation was his only path to avoiding adult prosecution. Rook, sleep-deprived and terrified, initially denied everything. But after hours of circular questioning, Harbour repeating that the evidence didn't lie, Crane insisting that silence equaled guilt, Rook began to waver. He said maybe he'd been near the parking structure. Maybe he'd seen someone. The detectives pressed. Who had he seen? What had happened? Rook's answers grew vaguer, more tentative. I don't remember exactly. It's possible. I might have been there. Eventually, he signed a statement that placed him near the scene on the night in question, though it contained no details about the crime itself and no admission of physical contact with Ember. That statement became the spine of the prosecution's case. Combined with Flint's testimony and a forensic hair comparison performed by analyst Juniper at the Arcadia lab, the narrative felt complete. Analyst Juniper, a microscopic hair examiner with 8 years of experience, testified that the hair found in Ember's hand was microscopically consistent with Rook's hair samples. She explained to the jury that hair comparison involved analyzing characteristics like pigmentation, medullary structure, cuticle scales, and cortical fusae under a compound microscope at 400 times magnification. She measured shaft diameter, assessed color intensity, and documented the presence or absence of specific morphological features. She could not conclude a definitive match. No examiner could, because hair microscopy lacks the genetic specificity of DNA, but she stated with confidence that the hair could have come from the defendant and exhibited the same class characteristics as his known samples. The jury heard the word consistent and absorbed it as near certainty. Defense counsel at trial, a public defender aliased as Wren, lacked the resources to challenge the science or hire an independent expert. Wren's cross-examination focused on the subjective nature of the comparison, but without a counter-narrative or expert rebuttal, the testimony stood unchallenged. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Rook had encountered Ember in the parking structure late at night. An argument escalated. Motive remained murky, though Prosecutor Slate suggested robbery or sexual assault that had been interrupted, and Rook strangled her. The medical examiner's timeline placed death between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Rook's work schedule showed he'd clocked out of the convenience store at 10:30 p.m., giving him a plausible window. The hair in Ember's hand, Slate argued, was evidence of a struggle. Flint's testimony about Rook's jailhouse confession corroborated the physical evidence. The pieces fit. Wren mounted a limited defense. She called Rook's co-worker, a teenager aliased as Birch, who testified that Rook had seemed normal during his shift and had mentioned plans to go home and study for a chemistry exam. She called Iris, who testified that Rook had arrived home around 11:15 p.m. and gone to his room. But Birch's memory was imprecise. He couldn't swear Rook hadn't left again, and Iris's testimony carried the weight of maternal bias in the jury's eyes. Wren argued that the interrogation statement was coerced and unreliable, that Flint had incentive to fabricate in exchange for favorable treatment on his own charges, and that the hair comparison was scientifically insufficient to prove identity. But she had no DNA evidence to offer as an alternative, no alibi witness who could account for every minute of Rook's night, no expert to dismantle Juniper's testimony. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned a guilty verdict. Judge Keystone, who had presided over the trial as well, sentenced Rook to 25 years to life. If you're finding this story as compelling as we are, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. Your engagement helps us continue exploring cases where justice took decades to surface. Rook entered the state correctional facility at Ironwood Ridge 3 weeks after sentencing. The facility, a sprawling complex of cinder block housing units surrounded by double-fenced razor wire, held over 2,000 inmates across 5 security levels. Rook was classified as medium security and assigned to a cell in D Block, a general population wing where the noise of metal doors and shouted conversations never fully ceased. His cellmate, a man serving time for armed robbery and aliased as Grit, offered terse advice on his first night. Keep your head down, don't borrow, don't lend, and never talk about your case. Rook followed the rules. He worked in the prison laundry for 19 cents an hour, his hands blistering from industrial detergent and the heat of commercial dryers that ran 16 hours a day. He attended GED classes in a cinder-block classroom that smelled of chalk dust and sweat, and he earned his diploma within a year. He wrote letters to Iris, who visited twice a month despite the 4-hour bus ride from Riverbend and the invasive searches required to enter the visiting room. Iris believed in his innocence with a ferocity that never wavered, but belief alone could not reverse a conviction. She hired a private investigator aliased as Trent to re-examine the case, but Trent's report, delivered after 6 months of work, found no smoking gun, no alibi witness who could definitively place Rook elsewhere, no evidence of police misconduct beyond the unrecorded interrogation, no alternative suspect with motive and opportunity. The appeals process ground forward with the speed of geological time. Rook's direct appeal, filed by a court-appointed attorney aliased as Mercer, argued that the trial court had erred in admitting the hair comparison testimony without sufficient foundation, and that Rook's interrogation statement should have been suppressed due to coercion and the absence of parental notification. The state appellate court affirmed the conviction in a published opinion, finding that the hair testimony met the standards for admissibility under the prevailing scientific consensus of the era. Citing a landmark federal case that had upheld microscopic hair comparison as reliable, and that Rook's statement, while obtained during a lengthy interrogation, did not rise to the level of involuntariness required for suppression under the totality of circumstances test. The ruling noted that Rook had eventually been given food and water, that he had not been physically threatened, and that he had signed the statement of his own accord after being read his Miranda rights. The decision was published 3 years after his incarceration began. Rook filed a post-conviction relief petition, alleging ineffective assistance of counsel. He argued that Wren had failed to investigate alibi witnesses, failed to challenge the chain of custody for the hair evidence, and failed to retain an expert to rebut Juniper's testimony. The trial court held an evidentiary hearing, but Wren's testimony proved damaging to Rook's claim. She explained that she had interviewed Birch and Iris and found their testimony insufficient to establish a complete alibi. She had reviewed the chain of custody logs and found no gaps. She had contacted 2 forensic consultants about challenging the hair comparison, but both had quoted fees exceeding her budget, and the court had denied her motion for expert funding. The judge found that Wren's performance, while not exemplary, had not fallen below the constitutional standard of reasonably effective assistance. The petition was denied. Rook was now 7 years into his sentence. The years accumulated. Rook celebrated his 21st birthday in a day room that smelled of instant coffee and stale cigarettes. He marked his 25th in the prison library, where he'd begun volunteering as a tutor for inmates pursuing their GEDs. He turned 30 in the infirmary, recovering from a stabbing during a yard dispute that had nothing to do with him. Wrong place, wrong moment. The wound healed, but the scar tissue reminded him daily of the fragility of survival inside. Iris aged faster than the calendar suggested. Her hair went grey, her knees weakened, and the bus rides to Ironwood Ridge became ordeals she endured without complaint. She told Rook during one visit that she'd never stop fighting, but her voice carried a weariness that frightened him more than his conviction ever had. The evidence from the original trial had been stored in the Granite County Evidence Warehouse, a climate-controlled facility managed by the sheriff's office and located in an industrial park on the outskirts of Riverbend. Items from cases older than 10 years were routinely catalogued and photographed before being considered for destruction to free up storage space. But biological evidence in homicide cases was retained indefinitely under a state statute enacted in the mid-1990s in response to the advent of DNA technology. The envelope containing the 3 hairs from Ember's hand remained sealed, labeled with a case number, and stored in a locked cabinet alongside hundreds of other items from cold cases and closed investigations. The evidence custodian, a civilian employee aliased as Moss, maintained meticulous logs tracking every item's location, condition, and access history. The hair envelope had been accessed only once since the trial, during Rook's direct appeal, when Mercer's investigator photographed it but did not request testing. It was this preservation, mandated by statute and maintained by bureaucratic inertia, that would eventually alter Rook's fate. In his 11th year of incarceration, Rook received a letter from the Riverbend Innocence Clinic, a non-profit legal organization affiliated with the Regional Law School. The clinic, directed by Attorney North, specialized in post-conviction DNA testing and had been reviewing Granite County cases where microscopic hair comparison had played a central role in securing convictions. North's letter was cautious but clear. Advances in mitochondrial DNA sequencing had made it possible to extract genetic profiles from hair shafts that lacked root material that had been required for nuclear DNA testing but was often absent in hairs shed naturally or pulled out without force. If the hair from Ember's hand could be tested using these newer methods, and if it excluded Rook, it might provide grounds for a new trial or outright exoneration. The letter asked whether Rook would consent to the clinic representing him in a post-conviction DNA motion. Rook responded within 24 hours. North filed a motion for post-conviction DNA testing under a state statute that allowed defendants to petition for testing of biological evidence if 3 conditions were met. The evidence still existed. The testing method had not been available at the time of trial, and the results could establish actual innocence by a preponderance of the evidence. The motion outlined the hair's significance in meticulous detail. It had been found clutched in the victim's hand, suggesting a physical struggle. The prosecution had argued at trial that it belonged to Rook, based solely on microscopic comparison. DNA testing could definitively confirm or exclude him. If excluded, the cornerstone of the state's physical evidence would collapse, and the remaining evidence, a coerced statement and jailhouse informant testimony, would be insufficient to sustain the conviction. Prosecutor Slate opposed the motion in a 30-page brief. He argued that the hair's presence did not necessarily indicate the assailant's identity. It could have transferred innocently through secondary contact, or Ember could have grabbed her own hair during the struggle. He noted that the original conviction rested on multiple pillars: the interrogation statement, Flint's testimony, and the hair comparison. Even if the hair excluded Rook, the statement and Flint's account remained. He further argued that the statute required a showing that the results would establish innocence, not merely create reasonable doubt, and that Rook had not met that burden. Judge Keystone, after reviewing briefs from both sides and hearing oral argument, granted the motion. She found that the hair's evidentiary significance at trial had been substantial, that mitochondrial DNA testing represented a genuine scientific advancement, and that exclusion would sufficiently undermine confidence in the verdict to warrant testing. The hair would be sent to an accredited laboratory for analysis. The testing was conducted at a private laboratory aliased as Helix Forensics, a facility located in a neighboring state and contracted by Granite County for complex forensic work. The laboratory director, a molecular biologist aliased as Dr. Vale, had overseen DNA testing in over 300 post-conviction cases. Dr. Vale extracted mitochondrial DNA from the hair shaft using a multi-step process designed to preserve the sample's integrity. First, the hair was cleaned with a series of chemical washes to remove surface contaminants. Then a segment of the shaft was pulverized and subjected to enzymatic digestion, breaking down cellular material to release mitochondrial DNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, which resides in the cell nucleus and is present in only 2 copies per cell, mitochondrial DNA is housed in the mitochondria and exists in hundreds of copies, making it recoverable from degraded or rootless hair. Dr. Vale used polymerase chain reaction amplification to target 2 hypervariable regions of the mitochondrial genome, HV1 and HV2, that exhibit significant variation among unrelated individuals. After amplification, the DNA was sequenced using capillary electrophoresis, producing a profile consisting of nucleotide positions and base identities. This profile was then compared to reference samples from Rook, taken during his intake at Ironwood Ridge, and from Ember, obtained from tissue preserved during her autopsy and stored by the medical examiner's office. The results were unambiguous. The hare's mitochondrial DNA profile did not match Rook's profile. It matched Ember's own profile, meaning the hare had belonged to the victim herself. Of the 3 hares originally recovered, 1 had been consumed in the original microscopic analysis, and the other 2 were tested in tandem by Dr. Vale's team. Both matched Ember's profile. Neither matched Rook. North received the report on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, delivered via encrypted email with chain of custody documentation attached. She read it twice, cross-referencing the nucleotide sequences against the reference profiles, then called Rook at Ironwood Ridge to deliver the news. Rook, standing at a wall-mounted phone in the corridor outside the visiting room, listened without interrupting. When North finished, he asked a single question: "What happens now?" North explained that she would file a motion to vacate the conviction, supported by the DNA results, an affidavit from Dr. Vale, and supplemental briefing on the unreliability of microscopic hair comparison. The motion would argue that the hair testimony, a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, had been scientifically unreliable, and that the new evidence undermined confidence in the verdict under the standard for actual innocence. The state would have an opportunity to respond, and Judge Keystone would hold an evidentiary hearing. The process could take months. The hearing convened on a grey morning in February, 14 months after the DNA results were finalized. The courtroom was half full, the gallery populated by journalists from regional newspapers and television stations, law students from the Innocence Clinic taking notes for future cases, and Iris, who sat in the front row with her hands clasped in her lap. Rook, transported from Ironwood Ridge in shackles that were removed before he entered the courtroom, sat beside North at the defense table. He wore a collared shirt Iris had sent him, a size too large now, and kept his gaze steady. North called Dr. Vale as her first witness. Dr. Vale took the stand with a binder of lab reports and a calm, methodical demeanor. North walked him through the testing process step by step: sample extraction, contamination controls, amplification protocols, sequencing methodology, comparison to reference profiles. She asked him to explain why the original microscopic analysis had been insufficient. Dr. Vale responded that hair microscopy, while useful for exclusion in some cases, lacked the discriminatory power of DNA and was prone to examiner bias. Studies conducted in the years since Rook's trial, including a landmark FBI review of thousands of cases, had documented error rates as high as 30% in hair comparison testimony, with examiners overstating the significance of matches and understating the limitations of the method. The hair found in Ember's hand, Dr. Vale concluded, was the victim's own, not the assailant's. It had likely been pulled or shed during the struggle, and clutched involuntarily as she lost consciousness. Prosecutor Slate's cross-examination focused on the possibility of contamination, mislabeling, or mix-up during storage or testing. Dr. Vale acknowledged that chain of custody was critical, but testified that the evidence envelope had remained sealed from the time of trial until Helix Forensics opened it under supervised conditions, documented by video and witnessed by a representative from the sheriff's office. Photographs and logs from the evidence warehouse corroborated this. Slate then pivoted to his fallback argument. Even if the hair excluded Rook, the conviction rested on other evidence, the interrogation statement and Flint's testimony. That evidence remained unchallenged by the DNA results. North anticipated this and called her second witness, a forensic psychologist aliased as Dr. Orin, an expert on false confessions and coercive interrogation techniques. Dr. Orin, a professor at a regional university with 2 decades of research on interrogation-induced confessions, testified that Rook's statement bore multiple hallmarks of coercion. The 9-hour interrogation, conducted without meaningful breaks and without legal counsel or parental presence for much of its duration, had employed a technique known as the Reed technique, a structured approach that begins with confrontation, asserting certainty of guilt, proceeds through minimization, suggesting leniency for cooperation, and culminates in obtaining a statement. Rook, a juvenile at the time, was particularly vulnerable to such tactics. Research had shown that juveniles were 2 to 3 times more likely than adults to provide false statements under prolonged interrogation, especially when confronted with fabricated evidence or threats of severe consequences. Dr. Orin reviewed the transcript of Rook's interrogation and highlighted specific exchanges where Detective Harbour had implied that physical evidence definitively linked Rook to the crime, a misrepresentation given the limitations of hair microscopy, and where Crane had suggested that silence would result in adult prosecution and life imprisonment. The statement Rook eventually signed, Dr. Orin concluded, was unreliable as evidence of guilt. It contained no details about the crime that were not already public knowledge, no confession of physical contact, and no explanation of motive. It was, in Dr. Orin's assessment, a product of psychological exhaustion and fear rather than genuine knowledge. Slate objected repeatedly during Dr. Orin's testimony, arguing that the reliability of the statement was a question that had been decided by the jury and that post-conviction challenges to confession evidence required a showing of constitutional violation, not merely expert disagreement. Judge Keystone overruled most objections, finding that the DNA exclusion created a new context for evaluating the statement's reliability and that Dr. Orin's testimony was relevant to the actual innocence standard. North's final witness was Trent, the private investigator Iris had hired years earlier, who had continued working on the case pro bono after Rook exhausted his appeals. Trent testified that he had recently interviewed Flint, now serving time in a federal facility for unrelated offenses. Flint had recanted. He admitted in a recorded statement that he had fabricated his testimony about Rook's jailhouse confession in exchange for a sentence reduction in his own case, a benefit facilitated by the prosecutor's office and never disclosed to the defense at trial. Flint claimed he'd been told by a detective that physical evidence already proved Rook's guilt and that his testimony would simply seal the deal. Slate's cross-examination of Trent was aggressive. He questioned the circumstances of the interview, suggested that Flint's recantation was itself unreliable given his history of dishonesty, and argued that even if Flint had lied, the hair comparison and interrogation statement remained. But the cumulative weight of the evidence, DNA exclusion, false confession dynamics, and recanted testimony created a narrative that was difficult to dismiss. North delivered her closing argument standing at the podium, her notes spread before her, but rarely consulted. She walked Judge Keystone through the evidence methodically, connecting each element to the next. The DNA exclusion proved the hair comparison was wrong. The hair comparison had corroborated Flint's testimony at trial, giving it credibility it didn't deserve. Flint's testimony had reinforced the interrogation statement, which was itself unreliable due to coercion. Remove any one of these pillars, and the structure wobbled. Remove all 3, and it collapsed entirely. No reasonable jury, presented with the full picture, would have convicted Rook. The state's case had been built on sand. Slate countered that the defense was asking the court to second-guess a jury's verdict based on hindsight and evolving science, that the state's case had been sufficient under the standards of the time, and that actual innocence required more than reasonable doubt. It required affirmative proof that no rational juror could find guilt. He urged the court to deny the motion. Judge Keystone took the matter under advisement. Rook returned to Ironwood Ridge and resumed his routine, though the uncertainty gnawed at him in ways that 2 decades of incarceration had not. He worked his laundry shifts, attended evening recreation, and wrote letters to Iris that he struggled to finish. Hope, he had learned, was more dangerous than resignation. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, Judge Keystone issued her ruling. The clerk's office called North first, then contacted the facility to notify Rook. Keystone had granted the motion to vacate. In a 23-page order, she found that the DNA evidence, when considered alongside the unreliable hair comparison, the coercive interrogation, and Flint's recantation, met the standard for actual innocence by clear and convincing evidence, a higher burden than North had been required to meet, but one Keystone applied to ensure the ruling would withstand appellate scrutiny. She noted that the prosecution's case at trial had relied heavily on the hair testimony to corroborate Flint's account, and that the exclusion of Rook's DNA fundamentally undermined that corroboration. She further found that the failure to disclose the benefit Flint received constituted a Brady violation, though she did not rest her decision on that ground alone, given the difficulty of proving the prosecution's knowledge at the time. The conviction was vacated, and the charges were dismissed without prejudice, meaning the state could theoretically retry Rook if new evidence emerged. In a press conference the following day, Prosecutor Slate announced that his office would not pursue a retrial, citing the passage of time, the lack of viable evidence, and the interests of justice. Rook was released on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after the ruling. The processing took 4 hours. Fingerprints for the database, photographs for the exit file, the return of personal property that had been stored since his arrest and now fit in a single manila envelope. He signed a dozen forms and received a check for $73, the balance of his prison account after commissary purchases and phone calls. North met him outside the gate, her car idling in the visitor lot. Rook climbed into the passenger seat and said nothing for the first 10 minutes of the drive. The world outside had changed in ways he couldn't yet name. Storefronts that hadn't existed, roads that had been repaved, trees that had grown tall. They stopped at a diner on the edge of Riverbend, a vinyl booth place with coffee that tasted like relief. Rook ordered eggs and toast and ate slowly, as if relearning the rhythm of a meal without a timer. The road ahead was not simple. Rook applied for compensation under the state's wrongful conviction statute, which provided financial restitution calculated at $50,000 per year of incarceration. The application required extensive documentation, certified copies of the vacatur order, affidavits from attorneys, proof of time served. The process could take years, and the statute's limitations meant Rook would receive approximately $1 million, a sum that sounded large until divided by 2 decades. His criminal record was not automatically expunged. That required a separate petition and a finding that the charges had been dismissed in the interests of justice rather than on procedural grounds. North filed the petition, and 6 months later, Judge Keystone granted it. Rook moved in with Iris, who had kept his childhood bedroom unchanged, the walls still decorated with posters from his high school years. He found work through a re-entry program that helped formerly incarcerated individuals transition to employment. He stocked shelves again, this time at a hardware store on the north side of Riverbend, and the manager, a man aliased as Kane, knew his history and didn't care. Kane had done time himself years earlier for a drug offense and believed in second chances. Rook appreciated the lack of questions. The case drew attention from advocacy groups focused on forensic science reform. The National Institute of Forensic Standards, a federal body aliased as NIFS, had issued a report years earlier highlighting the unreliability of microscopic hair comparison and recommending the review of cases where such testimony had been admitted without DNA corroboration. Rook's exoneration became a case study in that broader conversation, cited in law review articles and training materials for prosecutors and defense attorneys. Attorney North used the case in presentations to law students, emphasizing the importance of post-conviction DNA statutes, the need for mandatory recording of interrogations, and the dangers of incentivized informant testimony. She also advocated for open-file discovery practices that would have disclosed Flint's deal before trial, rather than 2 decades later. Ember's family, who had attended the original trial and believed in Rook's guilt, were left without closure. The real assailant had never been identified, and the case remained open in the Riverbend Police Department's cold case unit, though no active investigation was underway. Detective Harbour, now retired and living in a coastal town 300 miles away, declined to comment when contacted by journalists covering Rook's exoneration, though colleagues said he stood by his investigation and believed he had followed proper procedure. Analyst Juniper, who had performed the original hair comparison and since retired from the Arcadia lab, issued a brief statement through her attorney expressing regret that the science had evolved beyond the methods she had used. She noted that she had followed the standards of practice at the time, but acknowledged that those standards had proven insufficient. She did not apologize directly, and her statement sparked debate among forensic scientists about the balance between accountability and the reality of evolving methodologies. On a quiet morning 3 years after his release, Rook sat at the kitchen table in Iris's house, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. The sun angled through the window, illuminating the grain of the wood. He thought about the 20 years he had lost, birthdays, holidays, the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that constituted a life. He thought about the life he was building in their place, the hardware store job that had become a management position, the community college classes he'd enrolled in, the quiet evenings spent reading or walking the streets of Riverbend without a curfew. The anger had not disappeared, but it had settled into something he could carry. He thought about the hair, a single strand, preserved in an envelope, tested with technology that had not existed when he was 17. He thought about the chain of decisions that had led to his conviction, the unrecorded interrogation, the microscopic comparison, the incentivized informant, the jury that had believed what it was told. And he thought about the chain of decisions that had reversed it, the statute that preserved evidence, the innocence clinic that took his case, the judge who granted testing, the scientist who found the truth in a hair shaft's mitochondrial DNA. The question was never whether the system was perfect. The system was made of people, and people made mistakes. The question was whether the system could recognize those mistakes and correct them before another decade passed, before another innocent person marked another birthday behind razor wire. For Rook, the answer came 20 years late, carried on the wings of a single hair and the persistence of those who refused to let the case close. For others, the case is still waiting in evidence warehouses across the country, the envelopes yet to be opened, the truths yet to surface. The question remained open. Iris entered the kitchen, moving slowly, and poured herself coffee. She sat across from Rook and smiled, the kind of smile that held 2 decades of visiting rooms and collect calls and unanswered prayers. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was its own language, forged in the years when silence was all they'd had. Outside, the morning traffic began to build, the ordinary rhythm of a city waking up. Rook finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and prepared for another day of ordinary work in an ordinary life. The kind of life he'd dreamed about in a cell at Ironwood Ridge, the kind of life that had always been his right. If stories like Rook's move you to think critically about justice and accountability, we'd appreciate your thoughts in the comments. What reforms do you believe could prevent wrongful convictions before they happen?